It's my distinct honor and privilege to have Dr. Robert Sprich, class of 1960, for an interview this afternoon. We're in the Lewis Music Library. It's May 16th, 2002. Earlier on the tape, I had mentioned 1961 for his class year, but it's actually 1960, so that's a correction for the record. So, Bob, it's a real treat to have you here. Thank you very, very much for coming.
You're most welcome. I loved the music library from the time I set eyes on it, and the recent renovation has augmented the facility, and I'm pleased and proud to be here and to be a part of this project.
So I have some background questions. Some of them can seem kind of mundane, but they're always interesting anyway. Can you tell me about where you grew up?
Yes, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. The city and state are pronounced that way in spite of the way they're corrupted by people outside the area. I lived in what's called North St. Louis. St. Louis is on sort of a horseshoe bend in the Mississippi River, and I was at the extreme, grew up at the extreme northern city limit. Went to public school through fifth grade, and then was very lucky to be able to transfer to a private school named St. Louis Country Day at that time, and to do so on full scholarship, as my family could not have afforded the tuition. It was a school that had a classical education base, and so I learned 3 years of Latin and 4 years of German, and got to take classical music appreciation for total of 6 years. I've just given a modest amount of money to the music library in honor, in memory of my music teacher. His name was Robert Reeves, and really turned me on to interest in the classical music genre.
Did you play any instruments?
Let's see. Violin for 1 month and piano for 2. And but I was very good at the 4-speed turntable.
So, yes.
I still have a turntable that plays 16 RPM if anybody cares.
That's great.
And 78s. I have a couple of Carusos and an Amelita Gelakirchi on the old RCA Victor one-sided records.
Wow.
So I don't know why people are so busy throwing away their old stuff as soon as a new technology comes out. I've got records, even 78 records, but a lot of a couple hundred LPs, I guess, and some CDs and a lot of cassette tapes. So I just keep all of the capabilities in my system. Why not?
Yeah.
So I graduated high school from St. Louis Country Day, now merged with a girls' school called Mary Institute Country Day School, MICDS. And I cannot say enough about the education I got from there. I learned how to write complete sentences and write clearly, and that has put me in good stead all the way through college, graduate school, and henceforward. I probably profited a little bit from the good old boy network of private school admissions counselors, because out of my graduating class of 42, I think a dozen went to Ivies and 2 of us came to MIT, which is a rather high percentage, you would agree. I also started out wanting to major in engineering physics, and I later realized that I had been conned, because that was the Sputnik era, and both our U.S. government and large corporations were really terrified that the Russians were going to get a space station or a station on the moon from which they could take potshots at targets on Earth and like shooting fish in a barrel. So they were all sorts of resources were being put into science. And one of my humanities professors, a little bit envious of the science people, said none of them rides the subway unless the National Science Foundation is buying them the token.
Who was that professor?
Oh, that was Professor Carville Collins, a Faulkner scholar, and one of my principal mentors here. So I came up having, first of all, I did no college visits. I wanted to go to MIT, so I applied to MIT. Somebody said I should have an insurance school, so I applied to Cornell, and was lucky enough to get into MIT. Stepped off the train at South Station here in Boston, having never been east of Illinois before, and at that time, I don't think anybody did campus visits. And so the first week was fraternity rush week, for some crazy reason. Oh no, for a secret reason in the institute, because they didn't have enough housing for freshmen, and they had to funnel 20% off into fraternities. Anyway, I decided I couldn't make the decision of who I wanted to live with for 4 years in that time, and didn't get too many offers anyway, so I remained an independent, which is easier to do at MIT than at some schools where they are clubby and cliquey, and where not being a member of an eating club or something makes you a social pariah. I walked in the door, got involved, and I had supported myself, got spending money by repairing radios and TVs, and by projecting 16 millimeter movies for my church. I got paid for that, but also for my high school, where I did it as just one of my duties. It's always pleased me that after I left, they had to form a projection club with 7 or 8 members. It's nice that that it takes that many people to replace you. So anyway, when I got here, I followed I'd also done a little remote broadcasting of church services from my church. So I got involved with the radio station here for my freshman year anyway, and the lecture series committee, which probably still exists. Yep. Wonderful organization. And from them I became acquainted with British and other European films, Japanese cinema, Rashomon, and so on, and really broadened my interest in movies.
So the MIT radio station, what kind of broadcasting what kind of programming did they have?
Well, let's see. They did some interviewing. They did some classical music programming, actually, and popular. I pretty quickly found out that I was spreading myself a little thin, and so that was the easiest activity to withdraw from, and I soon did. The studio was in the basement of, the East Campus has the Parallels and the senior houses. Mm-hmm. So it was in the basement of one of the senior houses.
Wow.
And, cramped little studio and so forth, but functional.
So prior to coming to MIT, did you know that MIT had a School of Humanities?
Actually, it never occurred to me, because a corollary of this Sputnik thing was that the counselors were saying, the humanities are passé. Nobody of real intellectual rigor is going to go into that area. It's science, that's the thing. So I kind of realized that I was sold a bill of goods about getting an engineering or a scientific education. But when I got to MIT, I found out the spectrum of activities available, and by the middle or end of my sophomore year, I had changed my major to the double major program. Humanities and science, and mathematics was my science specialty, and statistics, of course, that so bored me out of my wits that I kept dropping it. They finally dropped as a requirement by the time I was a senior, and allowed me to grandfather that as my one of my not be having to be one of my requirements. So I was saved in a lot of ways. I didn't know anything about humanities beforehand, but I was lucky enough to come into contact with 4 first-rate scholar teachers, and they really pointed the direction.
You want to just say who those mentors were?
Absolutely. Carvel Collins, I mentioned, Faulkner Scholar, had taught at Harvard. This is a man who could teach a 3-hour class and without using notes, anecdotes about American literature, which was the subject at the time, and you would look at your watch and say, "Has 3 hours gone by?" And he would seem to be just kind of shooting the breeze, and yet when I look back on it, I see he was giving us the whole background and fabric and context of American literature, which I've been able to make use of in my own career, which is as a college teacher of literature and film. Secondly, there was Houston Smith, who came up from Washington University in St. Louis, and one of my high school teachers tipped me off about this guy. He says, you take a course with him or I'll stop being your friend. And I did. I came up and took a course with Houston the first semester he was here, and his reputation among students hadn't been established yet. So there were 35 people in the class. And the second semester, his reputation did get established. The number went up to 100, and his course remained the most popular humanities course, I think, for many years. He also took the unprecedented step of asking me to be his grader, and to sort of become his teaching assistant, if you will, even as a second semester junior, I guess I was then. And we've kept in touch over the years. He's now about 85 and just published another book. He was the author of a book called The Religions of Man, which has sold, I don't know, 8 or 10 million copies.
I got a copy of that.
Standard text, and wonderfully written from sort of every man's point of view. Just as you're formulating a question in your mind, he answers it. A sweet man and a great scholar. Third was Norman Holland, who was a somewhat younger man and just assistant professor when I was here. He was also my freshman advisor, and he went from stayed at MIT for a number of years, then moved to the State University of New York at Buffalo in an endowed chair, and has gone to University of Florida. I guess he's 70 now, but still having fun, and I keep in touch with him once every 2 months by phone or email. Finally, there was Bruce Maslish in history and psychohistory, and until recently, at least, I don't know whether Bruce is retired, but he's had a chair in rhetoric and is still associated with these two. Those are the 4.
He seemed to be a colorful figure, at least the little references that I've seen. There's some crazy picture of him with some wild costume. And, so.
Well, he was a Columbia graduate and kind of buttoned down and restrained. But, everybody deserves to kick up their heels.
Yeah. So tell me just a little bit more about your humanities component of your major here, and what did you work on for that? What was your specialty?
Well, I as soon as I became associated or aware of Carvel Collins, who taught just 2 courses, and they were limited to 25, and it was considered, often more than 100 people would apply to get in. I was delighted to be selected, so I took 19th century American literature, 20th century American literature, and the modern novel. And the modern novel included Kerouac's On the Road, which was modern, like just published, just out in paperback. So and he had done things like interviewing Erskine Caldwell and others for the Atlantic Monthly. He was really au courant as far as literature was concerned, and I worked with him as a research assistant for a time, and actually kept doing things for him beyond my undergraduate career, because I stayed in Boston. Thoreau said, "I have traveled much in Concord." I can say I've traveled much in Boston, because I went to MIT undergraduate and then Brandeis master's degree in English and American literature, and then Tufts for the doctorate in English literature. And lecture series committee, as I've mentioned, helped broaden my interest in film. I've always been interested in film, and I've been able to integrate that into my teaching career. And I just never realized that at the beginning of my career, which started full-time teaching in 1966, film was regarded as very suspect as an academic discipline. And so when I taught the graduate for credit, I had to practically sign my life away to get permission to do this, because it was just on the edge of respectability. But now, so it's nice to find out after the fact that you were a pioneer. It's like one of Moliere's characters was delighted to find that he's been speaking prose all these years. Didn't know what it was. But yeah, I made a not very smooth transition. I guess I talked about Collins' stuff, and I took a directed study with him. And Holland taught Shakespeare, comic sensibility, and the Introduction to Literature course, which I took with him. And Roy Lamson I don't mention as a major mentor, just because I took only one course with him, but he was an administrator who was quite important to me. I think I had an easier time than I otherwise might have in doing some of the weird things that I wanted to do, like petition not to graduate on time, because his secretary thought that I looked like her son. And Roy, who was a sweet guy, would pretty much sign anything that she would put in front of him. So I think I got away with a few things. This is to be stricken from the record. No, everybody involved has retired or died off, so there's no possibility of libels at this point.
So, moving on, you had worked here at the music library as a student assistant. What years were those?
Well, when I walked in the door, I of course came to the music library because of my love of classical music, and I made inquiries and found that the person who did repairs on the equipment had just graduated or left. In any case, the job was vacant, and the small amount of tools that were available were kept down in the micro reproduction laboratory on the basement level. And the recent Wellesley graduate Anna Faith Jones had newly taken the job as music librarian, and the atmosphere was so congenial that I accepted the job right away, kept it probably for 4.5 years, because I stayed on working part-time. I spent a summer, well, hey, the summer of, must have been 1960, I was the acting music librarian. I'd never taken up acting before. But at that time we were all the equipment was monaural.
Mm-hmm.
No, nothing was stereo. The huge monster main system for the big list for the main area was an invention of somebody over in the acoustics lab, and though he explained the esoteric principles of it to me a couple of times, could never make heads or tails of it. But it was certainly not conventional bass boost, treble boost, volume.
Uh-huh.
It had many knobs, and I used to fool around with them and could never tell, when you, like a Moog synthesizer or something, never knew what to plug in with what, but it sounded pretty good. One of the things that I was very pleased about was KLH, Henry Claus's gang, was over here on Cross Street near the Necco Candy Factory, and I went over hat in hand to see if they would give us a discount on some speakers. They were then making a KLH Model 6, which was compact and very good sound. And I explained what I wanted, and Malcolm Lowe, who was the L of KLH, said, "Gee, we've got a fair trade policy, so we can't sell anything at a discount. However, we have acoustically perfect speakers that have scratched cabinets, which we'd be glad to donate to you." I said, "Oh, I don't know, I have to think about that for a tenth of a second." So we got enough KLH Model 6s for all 6 listening rooms, I guess.
Wow.
And I experimented with various other things like viscous damped tone arms, so you couldn't drop them on a record and scratch them. And they were more trouble than they were worth, actually. But pretty much we just maintained the equipment that we had. And it was the amplifier was still vacuum tube
Mm-hmm.
at that time. For the through the period of time that I was here, there were not major changes.
Wow. Wow. Do you remember what the hourly wage for students was?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. It must have been something between $1.50 and $2,
Uh-huh.
because I had come up through the ranks of 75 cents an hour at home, and I think my first summer job in the aerospace industry was working for about $1.25 an hour. But the thing that I find astounding is that jobs like mine are now called work study and are considered part of the financial aid package.
Yeah.
It hadn't dawned on anybody. And even though I had a good scholarship, it hadn't dawned on anybody to restrict the amount of time I could work. And if I was having a big date and needed a little more money, I could, work up ahead and work a few extra hours, up to 20 a week. And so that was a very nice situation.
How many other student assistants worked in the library?
Well, now we're talking about a hierarchy here. Those who only knew how to place records on the counter and back in the rack, there must have been half a dozen.
Mm-hmm.
But those who were sophisticated in the mechanical, I was the one. I had a little backup from the people in the electrical engineering department if I got really stumped, but pretty much I handled it on my own.
Mm-hmm. What were the hours of the library? Do you remember roughly?
Well, let's see. I know they closed at 6 on Saturday, so let's
We
say
still do.
9 to 6. And one of the
It's 11 to 6 now on Saturday.
Oh, okay. One of the perks was that I had a library submaster key, so I could get into this place and lots of other interesting places in the Hayden building.
Uh-huh.
And I used to entertain myself I think we had a tuner, so we could tune in Boston Symphony on a Saturday night, and I could come in, lock the door again, point myself away from the door so people wouldn't bang on it and bother me,
Yeah.
and have a private concert.
Oh.
And the weekdays, probably not much change.
Mm-hmm. So when you came in this afternoon, we were looking at obviously the new space here. Is there anything more you want to say about the just the layout of the old space? I was here before the renovation, but even since after you left, things had changed to some degree. But
okay, now back in the corner away from the desk and nearest Walker Memorial, there was a recital room. Had a baby grand, enough space for a chamber music group of 2 or 3, and then maybe 15 seats.
Mm.
So, and it was double insulated so the sound wouldn't bother people who were in the main area.
Wow.
And Ernst Levy
Mm-hmm.
used to
Yeah.
play here.
Was that mostly for students and faculty, or were there outside artists that sometimes would play there?
It was an underutilized facility. There I can't recall there being any advertised concerts for people outside, and it was also not a practice facility in the sense that people signed up for it and came in. So I think it was the kind of thing that really didn't know that much what to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Were there ever concerts in the larger space, the reading room and stuff like that? Because later on, that's where there were concerts. But during your time here, were there?
Very few.
Uh-huh.
Very few. I can remember a cello and violin, viola, something, and maybe they even moved to harpsichord in. But that was rare.
Mm-hmm. The architect's original intent for this space, contrary to the wishes of the music section here, the architect had in mind a listening lounge. And there was always, it seemed like for a long time, some tension between the two ideals there. When you were here, how was that playing out? Because there was still music played, over the house sound system, but what was your take on it when you were here?
Well, I think it was a place you could come to kind of unwind, and I don't know that there was any pressure on the person in charge to play a certain kind of music. Mm-hmm. I think it was, at least when the summer that I was acting librarian, it was kind of my whim. But it was much like you get in a classical record section of a record store,
Mm-hmm.
put up the album cover and here's what we're playing now, and if you don't like it, goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
So nothing was ever raucous. I don't think we played any John Cage. Didn't drive anybody to heart attacks or catatonic states, but the music, there was music most of the time, and it was selected by the librarian in charge.
Was there any kind of programming element to it? Would there be a theme like one day, or is it a composer's birthday would come up or something like that? Were there any attempts like that?
There was a little bit of that,
Mm-hmm.
but it was not, as I recall, systematic. Or, for example, we did not do a GBH thing and put out a program guide for, here's what we're going to do for the next month.
Right. Was it throughout the time that the library was open during the day, or just some specified hours?
Well, it was a full day job for me, and I think in the summer they did close at 5 or thereabouts. But
as far as playing the music, was that
music.
was that all day?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Now, if nobody was there and you wanted to rest your eardrums a little bit, why, that was a possibility, and people could come in and suggest something or other, and you could say no.
Yeah.
We tried to accommodate, as I'm sure you do now.
So, did people come just to listen? Were there kind of regular people who would come like during their lunch hour or something to listen, or did you get a clientele like that, or was it just if you happen to come to the library for something else, you got to hear music?
I think there was a dedicated core clientele of two kinds: the folks who like to listen to music, and those who like to check out the scores and study music in a more serious way. I don't read music, so I never got into that, but I admire people who do. I got the C major scale was too much for me on the violin.
So the music that was played, was it more than classical music? Was there any jazz or popular music played?
No.
No.
As far as I know, the collection went in just into light classics. Friend of mine, I don't know on what statistical basis, thought that Scheherazade was the most requested piece of the most requested record here, and we'd wear out our copy about once every 2 years.
So I want to ask you about the collection itself, the books, the scores, and the recordings. When you were here, was there a systematic program to build the collection, or was it strictly were purchases made just on demands of faculty and students making requests? What's your memory on that?
Well, I didn't have anything to do with the purchasing. My feeling was that there were neither the resources nor the administrative green light to do a whole lot of building of the collection. I think Anna Jones paid attention to what was coming out, read the journals and so forth, and ordered new things as she thought they would be applicable. But no, it was a fairly slow build.
So the budget was pretty modest then.
I think so.
Yeah, yeah. Tell me about the books. We'll talk about the scores in a minute, but were there many books on music? Dictionaries. I mean, reference books, but also just standard scholarly literature as well.
Well, tended to be reference books and lives of particular composers, kind of thing, bios. I didn't get the sense, and I cannot remember specifically standing in front of the shelf and browsing the collection. I didn't get the sense that there was too much on music theory here, though the music library has always had the support of the music department.
Right.
And certainly, if there was anything that Klaus Liebmann or one of the other faculty, Greg Tucker, felt was essential, that would be a priority to get.
What's your memory of scores? Were there both study scores as well as performing parts for chamber music?
Yes, there were both. And I, when I saw recently a CD that was augmented with, so you could see the score as you were listening to the music, I thought, my goodness, what a step forward that is for somebody who is learning and likes to play along on whatever instrument. But there were scores to perform from, and also to study the intricacies of Bach fugues.
So, Were you involved in any way with helping out with concerts or productions? I'm thinking, for example, like the famous Tech Show. Were you involved in any way with that? And did you go to those? And what can you tell me about those?
I did not go to a lot of the tech shows. I don't like roasts, and I don't like kind of snide.
Mm-hmm.
Although one of my specialties is comedy, I don't like snide comedy, and so I was not drawn to those shows in a big way. Again, more. I was amazed at the spectrum of performance art on the MIT campus, and it included a Shakespeare Society, a Shakespeare performing group, a Gilbert and Sullivan performing group, which probably still goes on, and the symphony orchestra, which was garden variety students who happened to be virtuoso musicians as well as whatever their scientific specialty was, and I did go to those concerts, as well as the chapel music concerts in the chapel Thursday noons, which I still go to because I get the mailing list about that. That's a wonderful space, and I like to hear the Tracker organ played.
It's a great organ. So did you ever like sell tickets for a concert or help to organize things in any way? Were you involved in anything like that?
No.
Yeah.
My involvement was through the lecture series committee. Movies on a musical film, for example, might I helped out with both projection and ticket taking and things there, and that kept me busy because there were 3 film series here: Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night. And the Saturday night, the admission at that time was 35 cents. So if you want a cheap date, you can get yourself and your date in on one MIT ID. And they used to fill Kresge Auditorium for 2 shows. 900 people or 1,000 people or whatever that was, and that's a lot of 35 censes. So the result was that the lecture series committee people could sit down and say, well, who do we want to have as a lecturer? And if the fee was astronomical, top, the maximum fee that one would draw at that time, Bennett Cerf, $5,000. Okay. Because we had $30,000 in the bank at any one time from our little movie operation.
My. So there was this concert series called the Humanities series concerts, and they had very distinguished groups: the Juilliard String Quartet, and even the Boston Symphony. I read had come on that, and they seem to be, from what I gather reading, were quite popular and well attended. Are there any memorable concerts from that series that you particularly recall?
Well, I'd be interested in knowing when that got started, because I can't remember it as an organized entity, but
It seemed to be going in by the late 60s, at least in the annual reports for the School of Humanities, they mention that.
Okay, well, see, I'm late 50s. So
I'm sorry, I meant the late 50s.
Late 50s.
Yeah, right.
I think they were just getting started, and I remember particularly organ concerts by E. Power Biggs and Andre Marcheo, and those were quite exciting. And
they even had an institute organist. I forgot his name, but there was somebody on staff who was the MIT organist. And,
I recall that vaguely, but not in any detail.
Yeah.
I love the 2 Holdcamp organs.
Did you get a chance to hear Klaus Liebman in a recital as a violinist?
I think once in Kresge. Mostly I saw him conduct,
Yeah, right.
and he looked like some sort of magnificent bird with his long arms and his wearing tails.
Can you recall much about his violin playing?
No, Gregory Tucker was the violin virtuoso at the time, or
Oh,
at
I
least
thought Gregory was Tucker was a pianist.
Gregory was a pianist?
I thought he was.
Oh,
but
I could be wrong.
Yeah.
Memory plays tricks.
Uh-huh.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
I know that from the music department, I realized a different set of they have a different set of priorities. I would worry about, is the bass boost proper, and it would drive them nuts if there was a flutter or a wow or it was playing at the wrong speed.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, some folks have absolute pitch. I have whatever is the opposite of that.
Hmm. Do you remember anything about? Well, I want to ask you first about courses you took with Klaus Liebman and Gregory Tucker. But is there in performances? Do you remember Gregory Tucker's recitals or performances of his own music?
He was also associated with the conservatory in Cambridge, just off the Common.
Oh, the Longy School?
Longy.
Yeah.
Longy. He
Right.
taught over
That's
there.
right.
And I think did more performing there probably than here.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew Gregory Tucker just as a very fine individual and someone who would always take time to speak to students if they had, or work with students if they had any problems. Mm-hmm. And I was much saddened when he died of a heart attack very suddenly.
Yeah. Did you take, what music courses did you take when you were here?
Well, let's not be so hasty using the plural.
Mm-hmm.
I took the Introduction to Music with Ernst Levy.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was going to be duck soup because it already had all this music appreciation stuff. But he locked the door and said, "I've decided to teach ear training this time." And since I had great difficulty distinguishing between a fifth and an octave, I knew I was in deep trouble. But I stayed on in the course. I think it was. I had a habit at the institute. The standard load was 5 courses, but you could take more, and nobody said anything to you, and nobody sent you an extra tuition bill. Mm-hmm. I had a friend who once took 7, and got all A's, but that was Don Hatfield, and he's up there with Noam Chomsky as far as brilliance.
So you didn't take any courses with Klaus Liebman?
Didn't take any of his class. I just knew him anecdotally, and I was at his house once, helping him with some problem in his music system at home. He lived on Lake Street in Cambridge. That's near Mount Auburn Hospital. Lovely old home.
Do you have any kind of personal recollections of Klaus? There are so few people that I've had a chance to talk to who really had interactions with him, and just trying to get more of a picture of what he was like. I met him for about 30 seconds once, but that wasn't enough to get an impression of him.
Well, I have no idea how good he was as an administrator. As a college teacher myself, I've learned that the skills to be a department head are completely different from those needed to be a good classroom teacher. And so I can't comment on that at all, but I know he had a fine sense of humor and was a very well liked by the members of the MIT Symphony Orchestra, who felt that he not only provided them an opportunity to do what they love to do, but also kind of brought them along to a higher level.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a very striking man, tall, and under other circumstances, he could have played a Dracula part somewhere.
As I recall, he was even taller than me, noticeably so. Did you go to many MIT symphony concerts?
It wasn't part of my regular schedule, but I think there was a major one, fall and spring,
Mm-hmm.
for the 4 years that I was here, and I probably went to 5 out of the 8
Mm-hmm.
of those. Some of the peripheral events, like chamber music programs and so forth, got by me.
Mm-hmm.
I was not heavily into chamber music at that time. That and early music has been a development later, Handel and Haydn Society and so forth.
Any memorable concerts, either by the orchestra or just concerts in general that you heard at MIT? Things that really stand out for you?
Well, the organ concerts I've spoken of,
Mm-hmm.
and I certainly began to be interested in the harpsichord as an instrument. And there, I don't think we had one in the small space here in the music library on a regular basis, but I think they brought one in once,
Mm-hmm.
and I heard a recital that really, I mean, it's one of those experiences where the hairs on your neck stand up, and said, "This is an instrument that I think I would have gone out the next day and bought a kit and tried to build one, which would have been a big mistake."
Who was the harpsichordist for that concert? Do you remember? Was it
I don't remember.
Yeah, yeah.
A male person of short stature.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably not John Gibbons yet. I don't think he had burst on the scene at that point.
Could it have been? He's dead now. He taught over at Longy for a number of years. I'm forgetting his name.
I probably wouldn't remember it either, but anyway, it was delightful.
Yeah, there was a physics student and cellist from MIT, class of 1958. His name was Carl Kornacker. Did you know him? I know him from when I grew up in Ohio. He was a mentor of mine. Did you know Carl?
Didn't know Carl. There was a cellist in my class named Peter somebody who was quite good, but I did not know your man you're speaking of.
Yeah, so Carl went on and played professionally for a while. What about the MIT concert band with John Corley? Did you have much contact with go to any of the concerts?
A few band and brassy music is just on the edge of my interest. John Corley actually came out to play for a Bentley College commencement, maybe on more than one occasion, with the concert band, and the sound was superb. But I was not a big follower of that here, and I'm really not a jazz person.
Mm-hmm.
I just I see the enthusiasm that jazz generates for somebody like Woody Allen, or a real passion, and I admire that, but I don't share it.
Did you ever hear John Corley play the trumpet? He was at one time a fine trumpeter.
I think I remember he's doing a solo in Kreisky Auditorium.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
And maybe even playing along with the organ in the chapel.
There's a recording that I have that's undated, and it's John Corley with an organist, and no date or location, so that it.
Well, there are these music at MIT discs.
Yeah, this is
records.
a recording that he actually loaned me, but there was no date on it, and he couldn't remember when there was, and it would be nice if I could
Well,
date that.
I
It's
guess
the only recording of him playing.
it's a shame to lose a virtuoso's work in that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
I remember now that the recording I have of the MIT chapel organ has Roger Voisin as the trumpet soloist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about the MIT Choral Society? Did you go to many of their concerts?
Only very occasionally, and I knew nothing directly about them except that by reputation, again, they were extremely accomplished for a college group.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I constantly compare the image of the nerd with, at that time, the slide rule dangling from his belt as the outsider's image of an MIT student, and realize that that's a carefully cultivated myth.
Right, because it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist.
Yeah. I have my oldest brother still doesn't believe me. I've been here for so many years, and he's convinced.
Well, yeah, Mass Avenue nerd crossing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I ever, well, take that back. A few come to mind, but
Yeah.
that's there in the minority for sure.
Right. I know you said you weren't much into jazz. I have a few jazz at MIT questions. There was a group called the Tectonians. Did you have any contact with them at all? And did you know about what they did? They at one time played for dances on campus and played around town in some of the clubs. Do you have any recollections at all of their activities?
One of my extracurricular activities that I happened not to have mentioned was that I got involved in the production of the yearbook technique,
Mm-hmm.
and actually came up through the ranks to be editor-in-chief in my senior year. And all I remember about the Tectonians was, as with many other groups, the struggle to get them together for a group picture and to get somebody to write copy about it. And nobody gives a hoot about this when they're in the midst of it. And 10 years later, they regret all over the place that they don't have the record of who was with them in the group and what they did. But I remember having to pull teeth to get a group picture and a little paragraph, but I don't think I ever heard them perform.
Mm-hmm. Did you know anything about their reputation with the students, and were they kind of an active presence on campus, or did you have to kind of seek them out?
Well, I think as with the Shakespeare Players and the Gilbert and Sullivan group, there were a subset of people who was interested,
Mm-hmm.
and they were really interested, but it was not a phenomenon that swept the campus.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned earlier Roy Lampson, professor of literature and influential in development of Course 21, but he was also a jazz clarinetist, and he had a group called the Intermission Trio, which we saw pictures a little bit ago. Did you ever hear them play?
Never heard them play. I heard him play brief solo pieces and could hear his talent at the instrument, but really nothing very sustained.
Mm-hmm. Do you know much about where they played? It seemed like they played at faculty functions and certain MIT community gatherings. Was that basically their role, as far as you can recall?
I think so. They were a group that came together for fun,
right?
To for each other's pleasure, and if somebody else could get pleasure out of it too, why, that was great. I know they played the faculty club on the top of the Sloan building a few times. I don't know if that's still the faculty club.
Yeah.
I can remember them in that space. And Roy may have played for a Course 21 Humanities reunion, which we had after 25 years, I think. And I made an effort to visit him within a year of his death, but his wife said that he was so ravaged by, I guess it was cancer, that he really didn't want to have visitors, and I respect that. But he was not really a mentor. He was a facilitator for me, because my relationship to him was as an administrator in the program.
This next question you may not be able to answer much, but at MIT there's a long tradition of students playing chamber music for fun, not for performance. Were you aware of that, and anything you can say about that?
Yes, I was aware of it, and through this classmate of mine who was a serious cellist, and I was not in a major way passionate about chamber music at that time, but I was delighted to see space in the main buildings for practice rooms and spaces that could be used for that kind of small group performance. I thought that was a real commitment on the part of the Institute, which hadn't been obvious. I think when the chapel wasn't being used as a chapel, that was a space that could be used by a small chamber group or the little theater, but not much on the main campus.
This next question is a real shot in the dark, but my boss Peter kind of brought this to my attention. You had mentioned the MIT Acoustics Lab designing the equipment for here in the library. Did they do any kind of research in the area of what was later thought of as electronic music? Building synthesizers and actual composition. Was there any activity like that? Because later on, when Barry Verico came, MIT was a real center for that.
Yeah, the only contact I had with them was through this one researcher, whose name I can't recall, who built the listening or the amplifier for the main space here at the music library. The electronic music and all the other things I learned only much later through the documentary Theremin, An Electronic Odyssey.
That's a great film. So you weren't aware of anything like that? It's probably not until later after you left, but...
Yeah, the acoustics lab was in the old Building 20 somewhere, and I'm not sure I ever set foot in it. But Dr. X would come over every once in a while to give us a pep talk and fine-tune the instrument, whatever that meant.
So this last area, humanities and the arts at MIT, it's a richly fascinating subject for me, and there's lots of questions to ask about that. And there's a special place that those activities seem to have here that's different from a traditional liberal arts institution. And do you have any thoughts on that in general? And because most people come here to study science and engineering, but when they pursue the arts and music, it's with a real professionalism, and it's but they do it for different reasons, I think, in some ways than at a liberal arts institution. Do you have any thoughts about that and how it might be different, or your experience as a student with that?
Okay, well, as a background, I now teach at Bentley College, which is my first full-time job and likely to be my last. Uh, and they came up from just a certificate school to we're going to change the name to university any year now. But they have people who came to college thinking they wanted uh, business degrees of one sort or another, accountancy, uh, computer information systems, something like that. There's a little overlap with MIT, but the type of student was thought he or she knew what they wanted to get, and I think that at Bentley we do have the capability of offering Bachelor of Arts degrees in English literature or what have you. But I think that if a student opts to do that, they become an outsider uh, from the primary culture of the place. When I made the decision to switch from science into humanities, the atmosphere of the humanities department and the culture of the humanities department was such that I never felt I was an outsider. I always felt that there was so much going on here, and that the arts were not treated as icing on the cake or sophistication for Beacon Hill snobs or something, but as really part of the main pulse of life. That I couldn't have predicted that ahead of time, but I had an educational experience that I would put up alongside of any liberal arts experience. And hey, the 7 liberal arts include mathematics and include scientific stuff, and I believe that's been lost sight of. So a lot of my students have this weird idea that ability in the humanities and quantitative ability is somehow on a seesaw, and that if you have one, you can't have the other. I mean, somebody who's good in accountancy says, "Oh, gee, I've never been any good at writing sentences," and so why not? Let's go to work on that one. But the educational experience at MIT was enriched by music here at the library, live performances, BSO. I mean, BSO, after all, is walking distance across the, not with as much arthritis as I now have, but I used to live on Beacon Street and walk back and forth across the bridge. Who could say that they've lived on the water side of Beacon Street with a window looking over the Charles and the main court of MIT for $7 a week with kitchen privileges? It was a different time, but yeah, and the Boston area. I mean, this sometimes it gets hyped as the Athens of America and all that stuff, but it really is rich in culture. You can attend free or inexpensive concert events every day.
Yeah.
You can flunk right out. Some people do.
Yeah. Do you think there's I mean, when I think of MIT, I think of it as a creative and vibrant place, and creative in the best, in the largest sense of the word. And when that gets channeled into the arts, there's a particular kind of intensity and focus on that seems to me different than other educational environments. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think I would agree with you on that. Sometimes in a liberal arts college, the atmosphere gets a little precious as far as the territoriality of the humanities. And here at MIT, I found that there was a smooth interaction and dialogue between quantitative stuff and humanistic values and ethics and so forth. So yes, I thought it was quite a rich and exciting educational experience for me. I am just beginning to contemplate my retirement and about to go to the vice president with various demands for a severance package. And I've really felt that staying in the Boston area, staying in touch with MIT, and having gotten this training has been just tremendously beneficial to me. It's a good life.
Mm-hmm. When you graduated in 1961, the School of Humanities was officially inaugurated in 1951, if I'm not mistaken.
Sounds right.
And it was through some real dedication of some very visionary people, and it looked like in the 10 years since its founding, by the time you got here, that the school had really reached the professional stature of the other schools here, because that was their intent when they started it, that it had to have the same status. And
well, I think there was a dedication here, but I think there was also a push from outside. I think at some point the Carnegie Foundation, kind of gave MIT bad marks for not emphasizing humanities enough, and that's what led to the curriculum change of 1 out of 5 required courses being in the humanities.
That came out of the Warren K. Lewis report in 1948, the Commission on I forgot the exact name of the committee, but there was this campus-wide committee, and there's a big report which I've read, and they go into detail about that. And Dr. Lewis was a chemical engineer, and he led that fight for the creation of the School of Humanities.
Boy, am I glad they did. Otherwise, I might have been stuck in double E.
Yeah. And from what I can gather is that the original intent of the school was to include the other liberal arts, but because of neglect and also funding concerns, those things they kind of strayed from the vision, and then they picked it up again in the late 40s there.
Right. Yes. I don't know a lot about the prehistory, but what you're saying certainly makes good sense to me. People like Roy Lamson, they had to make very attractive offers to get them to leave tenured positions elsewhere, and that was and Carville Collins was regarded as a superstar as well. So was Houston Smith. Norm Holland was a different matter. He had gone to MIT studying electrical engineering, and was I think the editor of the Humor magazine when he was here. Good sense of humor. Then he went to Harvard Law School with the intention of becoming a patent attorney, but he found out that was not something he could do as a life's work, so he went back and got a doctorate in English, and was had just been here since '55, I think, the year before I came, and he was taking courses at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute to become, as he has, a internationally renowned scholar in literature and psychology. And I kind of, he challenged me. Well, if you want to study literature and psychology, you got to get some psychoanalysis, which I did, and it's been a happy blend of movies and literature, and I'm teaching a course in the fall called The Psychology of Characters in Film, and it really tries to look at how can we become emotionally involved in fictional creations that are on a two-dimensional screen, and in some cases maybe more involved than some of the people in our actual physical lives, good and bad, villains, heroes, whatever. That's the one of the things that really fascinates me.
I didn't get a chance earlier. This is a nice lead into the subject and a nice way of rounding out this interview, asking you about your own professional interests. What was your dissertation topic on your PhD dissertation?
I took a course at Tufts, a seminar in the literature of the 1890s in England, and the teacher in that course, Michael Fixler, was interested in a man called Havelock Ellis, who was an exact contemporary of Freud's and got into some of the same areas that Freud did. He is best known for a 7-volume work called Studies in the Psychology of Sex. And strangely enough, his message is sexuality is okay and not something to beat people over the head with in the repressive religious traditions. He also was a literary critic who resurrected and brought out new editions of the Jacobean, some of the Jacobean dramatists post-Shakespeare, like Webster and I guess Marlowe was still doing okay, but people had gone out of print. And he was a guy writing in the end of the 19th century who sounded like a 20th century critic, and he was already prepared to espouse the kind of literary style of Joyce's Ulysses and Proust's work, Remembrance of Things Past. And this came out most clearly. He wrote for a periodical called the Savoy that only had about 6 or 8 issues in the 1890s. But Yeats published in that, and Aubrey Beardsley did, and was Oscar Wilde in it? Maybe a bit. Anyway, he did a thing on Hardy's Jude the Obscure, which was a novel that scandalized people at the time when it came out, because it seemed to speak approvingly of 2 people living together without being married and having children. And the thing that caught people off guard was, if this had been a young upstart, why, they would have just panned the novel and savaged the guy, and that was the end of the road. But this was a guy who had been looked up to as a novelist for 20 years. And I've read reviews that say, people don't know which way to run and hide from this new Hardy novel. I also have a theory that I won't expound, but that was his last novel, Jude the Obscure, and he said in the second edition, you have the public has driven me from writing the novels. I think he ran out of things to say in the novel and wanted to go out with a bang, because he continued to write poetry and other stuff after that. I need to do some more work to substantiate that one. Anyway, Havelock Ellis was in this bridge between literature and psychology. And ironically, he didn't. One might have expected he would talk up sex. He talked it down. He said, "Hey, what's all this fuss about Hardy's Jude, the sexuality in Hardy's Jude the Obscure? Let's look beyond that to its merits as a work of literature." And that was something that almost none of the other critics could do. So that interested me, and I wrote a dissertation on that, and I went over to England to present a paper to the Havelock Ellis Society, and I was kind of asked if I would make an effort to do a definitive biography of Havelock Ellis. And I came close to doing that, but boy, am I glad I didn't. There's been one done, and my dissertation and a couple of other things are credited in that book. But it took 7 years, and I think it led the scholar through a divorce. And I'm happy to say that I didn't have to have that experience. I have a lovely wife of 40 years that I'm still with. It would have been a big mistake, because as long as I'm a literary critic or a film critic, I could say, this is my opinion, and somebody can disagree violently, and that's his opinion. But as soon as you get into biography, you got to go checking, did Havelock Ellis really say this? Did he really appear at such and such a place? And that's a whole different ballgame, and not one that interests me. I like to stay in the realm of the imagination, and I can retreat back there whenever anyone gives me a hard time.
But the field of criticism as a scholarly interest is, I appreciate what that is, and it seems like you've kind of continued in that vein with your work with film.
Yes, I had. There was a very well-known scholar in, or a groundbreaking scholar in literature and psychology named Simon Lesser, who did a 1958 book called Fiction and the Unconscious. And he taught at UMass Amherst. And I got to, it was one of these things where I've done this a few times. You write a fan letter to somebody, and it's not just a gushy fan letter. It says, I liked your work, and here is chapter and verse. This is what I liked about it. Well, I got to know him, and had a real affection for him. So eventually he got some form of dementia that they didn't want to call Alzheimer's at the time, but they might as well have called it that, and really lost it. He had in mind to collect his short essays in a volume, and he even titled it, called The Whispered Meanings. So I picked up the ball on that one, and published it along with, and this was kind of an amazing experience. The UMass Press, where he taught, wanted to do the book, but they said, we'd like you to have an in-house consulting editor, that is another man who was interested in the field and a member of the English department. His name was Richard Noland. And so I read something that he'd written on Simon Lesser, and I said, this man's approach is similar to mine. How about bringing him on as a co-editor? They went into a state of shock. Nobody has ever said that to the press. But it was a labor of love, and it turned out, deja vu, I had met Richard Noland in New York City in the apartment of a mutual friend. He'd done his graduate work at Columbia, Noland, and so did John Covington, who was a year ahead of me here at MIT. And so he kept looking familiar to me, and so we finally traced it back. We worked together. It was great fun, and I discovered that it's much more fun as a scholar to collaborate and dialogue than to sit in a bloody Carol in Widener Library and try to crank out your stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can work with somebody who regards themselves as a peer and doesn't try to pull rank on you all the time, it can be a beautiful experience. I did what's regarded as a definitive article on the original Star Wars. I did it in collaboration with a child psychiatrist named Martin Miller, and he would his child patients would talk about Star Wars all the time as a way of talking about the dynamics of their family. And he lived in the Woburn section of Newton, which I do, about 6 blocks away. So whenever he'd have a cancellation of a 50-minute hour and I would be working at home, I'd go over there, we'd have coffee, and we'd work on our project. And we cranked it out. So I discovered that you don't lose any brownie points as a scholar for having a second author, especially if that author is somebody from another discipline or another academic institution. Mm-hmm. And so it's been golden. I went to work for Bentley as assistant professor in 1966. Was promoted to full professor in 1977. So I've been I've enjoyed my academic freedom. I usually get asked what courses I would like to teach. Occasionally the department head will ask me to do something that they need, but mostly I put together, films I would like to see again and teach a course in those. So looking back, I feel quite lucky. There was not a commencement speaker, but a student baccalaureate service speaker one year at Bentley, and his advice to students was a lovely parody of the kind of crap you usually get. His advice to them was, be tall. And if you can't be tall, be lucky. Now that was something to take away from.
That's great.
Yes.
Something that the question that came to mind, I don't know why it didn't occur to me earlier with your work in film. There's a professor here whose expertise is film music, Professor Martin Marks. Are you familiar with any of his work? He's written some books on silent film music, and he plays a lot for silent films. But when you're teaching courses on films, do you address any of the use of the music or anything in the films?
Well, I would certainly subscribe to the notion that the right soundtrack can make or break a film. One of my all-time favorite films is The Third Man, and the zither music in that film sets the mood, does foreshadowing, absolutely prepares the audience for what is going to come and what they didn't think was going to come. And this is that the case can be made for. I guess I once heard a lecture that said film score is tremendously important, and I know I followed with Star Wars. John Williams' music for the first one was pretty good, and it's gotten increasingly repetitious later. But I've seen Marx's name in film texts and references to his book, but except in something like George Lucas's American Graffiti, the soundtrack on that one is practically an anthology of all the favorite songs of popular songs of the time, and they're so integral to what's going on in the primary action that it's a stroke of genius.
So, recommend you taking a look at some of Martin Marx's works. It's quite quite striking, and it's certainly changed my view about film music. And
I will take your advice.
Yeah.
I'll be happy to
yeah,
do that.
I think he'd be interested in to kind of know about your work too. And
You know, I tend not to spout theory much. And for a while, people were talking about the important difference of whether the music on the soundtrack is music that can be heard by the characters in the film, or whether it's music that's for the audience only, added to whatever dramatic thing is going on. And somebody invented the terms diegetic and non-diegetic, and I just conducted a campaign against that terminology. I mean, hey, can the characters hear the music, or can they not hear the music?
I heard those terms too.
Yeah, they've never found their way, as far as I can tell, into a widely circulated glossary of film terms.
Yeah.
But no, I'm not going to talk about my colleague that likes to use that, because someone might think that I was regarding him as a pompous ass.
Yeah.
But if he's a pompous ass, he's only an associate professor, and he's my age. And I will not mention names or initials.
Well, I want to thank you for your generosity this afternoon. If there's any closing remarks about the library, about MIT or the Humanities, there's certainly time to do that. And
well, I would am going to retire within the next 2 years, and I don't think that I am going to have any trouble, as some few people do apparently, not having enough to do, so they follow the wife around the house when she does housework and laundry. There's actually a film about that called Rich in Love that has Albert Finney and Jill Clayburgh in it. And the guy retires, the husband retires, and he doesn't know what to do with himself, so he just follows his wife around, drives her crazy. She leaves. It's not going to happen to me. Gee, that was a great riff, but I forgot what the point of it was. Oh well. Like Mark Twain, I can tell a shaggy dog story every now and again. College students don't know what a shaggy dog story is.
Yeah.
I have to educate them. They don't know what a foil is in drama. And those are two of the things that I contribute. Oh, well, what I was thinking about is that I have been looking back on my career, and I've mostly written about specific movies. I wrote about Star Wars. I've written about the futile attempt to make a movie from Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, and Collins was a Faulkner scholar, so I promised him that I would put his essays together in a collection the way I did for Simon Lesser, and I am making use of the latest technologies, putting things on disk and using publication on demand and a lot of other things, and I'm going to do that for him. He died in 1990 suddenly, and certainly as my mentor. I mean, he really. I mentioned the 3-hour lecture just goes by, tells anecdotes. I have never taken a lecture notes. I just have about 3 points that I want to make. I write them on a 3x5 card and wing it from there. And I have no illusions. There was a time when there were 30 candidates for every opening in the teaching of literature and film at the college level, and I'm just very lucky to have been able to stay in the Boston area, to be able to get a tenured position where I'm essentially allowed to do whatever I like, and at a school where teaching is numero uno, good teaching, and scholarship, well, that's nice too. So, I've published some stuff, and actually the Star Wars thing has gotten the widest audience. I think it's in most bibliographies of science fiction film. And right now, I am working on an essay on the movie Mumford, and also on Pleasantville. So I'm still. I mean, the question: are we having fun yet?
Yeah.
I still am. I love what I do, and I've had liked being able to say in the Boston area. I married a Radcliffe girl. We went to different schools together. I even dated a girl on her floor, but never met her while we were both undergraduates. But she went to social work school at Simmons, and mutual friends fixed us up at that time. I have 2 kids, a son who has an MBA from Bentley and works in Silicon Valley, just outside San Jose. And I have a daughter, Susan, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and PhD, and a clinical instructor of psychology at Harvard Medical School. So I'm proud of that gang. And not to mention the 2 granddaughters, ages 4 and 7, whom I get to babysit for twice a week.
Wow.
I would pay money to do this most of the time. Most of the time.
That's great.
I've enjoyed talking with you.
So thank you so much.